Good evening, everyone. James Hancock here. I'm back to review the new horror movie Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, produced by Guillermo del Toro and directed by Andre Ovredal. If you were into horror as a little kid, anytime from the 80s until now, there's a very good chance you're familiar with the source material from writer Alan Schwartz and, more importantly, with art by Stephen Gammell. Back in the 1980s when I was a little kid, the first of the eventual 3 volumes was just all over the place. Every classroom, every library, and every household seemed to have a copy, and I found it absolutely fascinating. Apparently, there have been a lot of controversies over the years about what age is the appropriate age for kids to read these books. I fell in love with the first one when I was 9 years old. However, one of my friends would spontaneously cry and scream anytime he saw some of the more lurid drawings contained within the first volume. But for me, it was the signature style of Gammell that first drew me in, and his art has become so closely tied to these stories that when there was an attempt to publish these books in 2011 with more kid-friendly art replacing the original, it was totally rejected outright by readers. But in anticipation of this movie, for the first time in decades, I revisited some of the classic tales from volumes 1 and 3, and I was blown away by just how simple and short so many of these tales are. Some of them barely qualify as a paragraph, but I'd argue that these books are one of the best gateway drugs ever created for kids to get excited about the horror genre, or about reading and writing, or just the art of storytelling in general. A lot of the stories aren't even meant to be read as stories. They're actually almost like a tutorial on how to tell the story around a campfire because they give you instructions on the end about how to reach out and scare one of your friends. In any event, the ability to whip out one of these stories when you're a kid at a sleepover, once the lights are out and you're trying to terrify your friends, I think that immediately earns you a hell of a lot of street cred. But knowing how beloved and popular these books are, the movie does its best to try to take inspiration from a variety of the classic stories in order to form the spine of this new movie. Director Andre Ovredal's previous movies, Troll Hunter and The Autopsy of Jane Doe, are way more hardcore and definitely much more adult-oriented, but you can tell he's doing his best to deliver a PG-13 horror movie that kids might find exciting. At my screening tonight, I had an entire row of little kids behind me with far too few adults to supervise them, and initially I thought this would just be disastrous, but it actually became a lot of fun studying their reactions. They giggled at the appropriate jokes, and they absolutely screamed in terror at the frightening bits. One kid literally shit his pants and had to be taken out of the theater for a diaper change. And some might argue that these kids are way too young to be there in the theater watching this movie, but my attitude always is that if a kid is having fun and an entertaining experience watching something, then they're probably ready for it. But my overall point is that this movie is not designed to appeal to aging hardcore horror fans who have tattoos from Lucio Fulci movies carved into their foreheads. But if you're a hardcore fan who's looking to recruit the next generation of fans and you want to expose some little fellas to something that'll entertain them but without giving them nightmares for a month, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark could be the perfect feature attraction for slumber parties over the next few years. Just judging the movie overall, in my opinion, the movie is kind of front-loaded with its best material and really runs out of gas by the end, but I'm not sure how many kids would actually notice. Now, I don't know how many people out there are actually worried about hearing spoilers for a kids movie, but if you are worried, now's the time to bail out on this video because I do want to call attention to a few ingredients that I think this movie handled pretty well. Structurally, I was pretty impressed with what they came up with in order to open the door to adapting as many of the stories from the text as possible. The opening 30 minutes really benefits from how the movie capitalizes on some classic horror tropes while making them feel fresh on the whole, but it's Halloween night, 1968, and after an evening of watching a horror double feature at the drive-in, some teenagers decide to check out the local haunted house, a building that enjoys its fair share of urban legends, in particular about a girl who was locked in a room by her family where she spent her time writing horror stories. The kids find her book, and they learn to their horror that the book is possessed by the author's spirit, one that is prone to lashing out at the living by spontaneously writing stories in blood, which always end up coming true. And with each tale that appears on the page, one more teen gets picked off, and now the survivors have to figure out a way to put her spirit to rest. Now, I've seen a ton of horror movies over the years. I've enjoyed a pretty steady diet since the early 80s, but I will admit that a few scenes did manage to give me the willies. If you're a fan of the books, you'll definitely recognize ingredients from Harold, The Big Toe, The Red Spot, Mitai Dodie Walker, and The Dream, and sometimes these tales overlap and are blended with elements from other stories and nursery rhymes and songs scattered throughout the 3 volumes. Visually, unfortunately, the movie has very little in common with Stephen Gammell's art, although the creatures from Harold and The Dream look like they leaped right off the page. The 2 death scenes involving these monsters were easily the most intense scenes of the movie, and the kids behind me were squealing in absolute delight. Also, the gradually growing pimple in the story The Red Spot definitely had people writhing in disgust as well. Part of me wonders what might have been if they had decided instead of a live-action feature to make a series of animated shorts as well, kind of an anthology movie. But that's not the direction they chose to go, and on the whole, I will admit, I did have fun with it until the last act, where the movie falls into that predictable trap that so many horror movies fall into, where it becomes more like an action movie with a series of chases and thrills that are based more on excitement as opposed to relying upon mood and atmosphere. It drives me crazy just how many horror movies lose sight of the style and the mood that got them to the climax in the first place. But I will applaud the filmmakers for taking a crack at adapting beloved material that has never before been seen on the big screen. We see so many remakes and sequels these days that frankly I was relieved just to experience something new at the multiplex. But it's director Andre Overdahl's next project that has me much more excited. I was listening to an interview with him on Mick Garris's Postmortem podcast, a podcast that I strongly recommend for fans of horror, fantasy, and sci-fi. But Andre mentioned that he's working on an adaptation of Stephen King's early novel, The Long Walk, which was first published in 1979 under his famous pseudonym, Richard Bachman. The novel's never been adapted by a filmmaker, and it's definitely part of this giant Stephen King renaissance that's going on right now, and I'm really fired up to see what Overdahl will do with it. So I'm not sure how well this movie's going to do, but I can't imagine that reviews will play that much of a role. This flick is all about the marketing and the hype, and if kids get excited by the trailer and end up dragging their friends and their parents along with them to see it, the movie could easily end up enjoying a nice, healthy theatrical run. There's also ample material for as many sequels as they could hope for, so if this movie catches on, it might become a big new franchise. This is not the kind of movie that I'm going to feel compelled to revisit. It's not the kind of movie that I'm going to be recommending to my friends. However, it is something that I might consider showing to my nieces and nephews if they ever express an interest in watching some horror movies. In any event, I think that's all I got for now, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this sucker up. But if you want to hunt me down on Twitter and talk about horror or Guillermo del Toro or any horror-related topic, you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax. But if you enjoyed this review, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would really appreciate it. But thanks as always for watching. Hope everyone has a great weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.